Hi, and welcome back to Mind Meet Machine. You should notice that there are some pretty drastic improvements around here. Hopefully my camera looks a lot better. With any luck, it'll shake a lot less. You'll also see once we get into it that Claude has had some pretty substantial improvements as well. I have improved the visual responsiveness. I think the latency should be down. You may have noticed some cuts that I had to do in the last version. And I've hooked it up to 11 labs. We should see a lot less bad responses from AWS Poly, so the audio should sound better. So I'm excited about that. One thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't discuss in the last episode was how I got interested in this kind of format. So I used to, as soon as LLMs got big, I was really interested in figuring out how I could talk to them and learn from them and try to abuse them and red team them. And I just got really interested in just seeing how far down the rabbit hole I could go with them. So I would have these nights where I drank, frankly, and just had drunken conversations with Pi specifically. Pi, I think, is a really great conversational AI. I think that Claude is better for sure, just as far as like its knowledge and the things that it can do, which is why I've decided to use it right now. We may at some point play around with Pi and see how it does. But for now, I do want to focus on Claude 3.5 Sonnet. I am trying to introduce to the format the thing that, like, trying to recreate what got me interested into it, which was drinking. Today, I'm going to be drinking a Redbreast 12 while I talk to Claude. I'm doing it in honor of a trip that I'm taking to Ireland this week. So I'm leaving on Sunday for work, and I have been there a few times, always for work, but it's always a really good time. Redbreast 12 in honor of Ireland. It is a standard Irish whiskey, single pot, which means that it comes from a mix of malted and unmalted barley. So it kind of has this like rich, creamy texture and a little spicy, but goes down super easy. Hopefully I don't get too drunk on it while we're talking, but cheers. Today's discussion is going to be revolving around something that I actually maybe am uniquely qualified to talk about in this space. Most AI enthusiasts probably are not former attorneys with a background in fair use. We're going to talk a little bit about fair use and its history in the United States and why it may or may not apply to LLMs searching the internet for a whole bunch of content. There have been arguments for and against it. I have my own particular view. When I was an attorney, was a summer fellow at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society, so I was protecting artists. In this particular case, I lean a little bit more towards the AI companies for reasons that we'll probably dig into, but just wanted to lay out my background a little bit here and maybe some of my proclivities. And we'll kick off talking to Claude. Hey, Claude, just for the audience here, and I'm sure most of them know, but can you just give us a brief background on LLMs and specifically how the training for them works? We're off to a good start. All right, I think we've fixed our problem, so let's try it one more time. Hey, Claude, can you give the audience a brief explanation on how LLMs are trained, specifically kind of data that they use, how they use that data, etc.?
Certainly. Large language models, LLMs, like myself, are trained on vast amounts of text data from various sources, including books, websites, articles, and social media. This data is processed using a technique called unsupervised learning, where the model learns patterns and relationships in the text without explicit labeling. The training process involves predicting the next word in a sequence, which helps the model understand context, grammar, and semantics. As the model processes billions of examples, it develops a statistical understanding of language. The data used is typically diverse, covering multiple languages, topics, and writing styles. This broad exposure allows LLMs to generate human-like text and perform various language tasks. However, it's important to note that the training data can sometimes introduce biases or inaccuracies, which is an ongoing challenge in the field. Does this give you a good overview, or would you like me to elaborate on any specific aspect?
No, I think that was a pretty good overview. And so now I'd like to switch gears towards some of the lawsuits that have been filed in this space. So most recently, I think the RIAA has sued Suno and someone else who I can't remember for training their AI on basically all copyrighted musical productions. Similarly, the New York Times has a lawsuit claiming that OpenAI infringed their copyright, and there are various other copyrights in the space as well. Can you just briefly touch upon the gist of what the arguments here are?
Certainly. The lawsuits you're referring to highlight a growing tension in the AI world, particularly around copyright and fair use. Let's break down the key arguments. The core issue in these lawsuits is whether AI companies can use copyrighted material to train their models without permission or compensation. The plaintiffs, like the RIAA and New York Times, argue that this use infringes on their copyrights and potentially devalues their original work. On the other side, AI companies often argue that their use falls under fair use, a legal doctrine that allows limited use of copyrighted material without permission for purposes like research or transformation of the original work. These cases are particularly complex because they're pushing into new legal territory. Traditional copyright law didn't anticipate AI training, so courts are grappling with how to apply existing principles to this new technology. There's also a broader debate about the impact on creative industries. If AI can generate content that mimics copyrighted works, what does that mean for artists, writers, and musicians? It's a fascinating intersection of law, technology, and creativity, and the outcomes of these cases could have far-reaching implications for the future of AI development and content creation. What's your take on this? Do you see a clear right or wrong here?
No, I definitely don't see a clear right or wrong. I will say, when you think about fair use, and we'll get into the 4 specific cases that are specifically fair use a little bit later, but one thing that I think about is this was a law that was designed to help humans be creative. The RIAA's argument, effectively, is this is a law for humans, not necessarily a law for machines. So when you have a machine that can literally consume every piece of data that's ever been made and then basically makes humans more or less useless, arguably. I don't think that's true necessarily, but it is true to some extent, I think. Then there are some new considerations for what the law intended versus what it's actually doing. So if I'm OpenAI, I'm saying there's this law that says that essentially if I don't use this copyrighted material and parrot it back, if there's transformative use, if there are some other use cases, then I should be okay. And that's definitely true for humans. The fair use doctrine is an exemption, which means you are effectively admitting that you have committed a copyright violation if you're arguing it. But you're saying that because it falls into some of these enumerated categories, then it's okay. I don't know if a machine necessarily should be able to claim the same thing. Now, based on how the law is written, I would say there's a strong argument that OpenAI, for instance, has done nothing wrong. That doesn't mean that it's not time to revisit some of the laws that have been written and rewrite them if we think that it is appropriate. I think the U.S. has been very bad, generally speaking, as far as internet law. We have been terrible at going back and adjusting laws to consider the internet. So if you take an internet law class in law school, most of it is how these antiquated laws are applied to the internet. And the laws really don't, for the most part, don't get updated. It's just you take how they're written, you try to apply them in the context of the internet, and then finger to the wind, hope for the best. But I think it's probably time to go ahead and revisit a lot of these things and see what makes sense for us in society. But I did think, Claude, that it might be nice to take a historical deep dive into some of the cases in the past that have to do with technological disruption. So maybe you can talk about the photocopier or the VR case, or both. Kind of talked for a lot there. We'll see how good Whisper is at transcribing that. In the meantime, I will enjoy some Redbreast. One thing that we need to get better at here is the latency. So I'm really hoping when OpenAI introduces their new voice mode that we can be using that and effectively have zero latency. So I am quite excited for that.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to delve into some historical cases that deal with technological disruption and copyright law. These cases are particularly relevant to our current discussion about AI and copyright. Let's start with two landmark cases, the photocopier case and the VCR case. The photocopier case, Williams and Wilkins Covey, United States, 1973. This case involved scientific publishers suing the National Library of Medicine for photocopying articles without permission. The publishers argued this was copyright infringement, while the library claimed fair use. Key points: 1. The court ruled in favour of the library, citing fair use. 2. They considered factors like the non-commercial nature of the copying and its purpose to advance scientific knowledge. 3. This case set a precedent for considering the public benefit in fair use cases. The VCR case, Sony Corp of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc., 1984. This is often called the Betamax case. Movie studios sued Sony, claiming that its Betamax video recorders facilitated copyright infringement by allowing people to record TV shows. Key points: 1. The Supreme Court ruled in favour of Sony, establishing the substantial non-infringing use doctrine. 2. They found that time-shifting, recording shows to watch later, was fair use. 3. This case was crucial in allowing the development of new technologies that could have both infringing and non-infringing uses. Both these cases show how courts have grappled with new technologies that challenge existing copyright frameworks. They often tried to balance the rights of copyright holders with potential public benefits and technological progress. These rulings have some interesting parallels to the current AI debates. 1. They consider the transformative nature of the use, like AI training. 2. They weigh the potential harm to copyright holders against broader societal benefits. 3. They grapple with how to apply existing law to unforeseen technological advancements. However, as you pointed out, AI presents some unique challenges. The scale and speed at which AI can process and generate content is unprecedented. This might indeed call for a re-evaluation of our copyright laws, as you suggested. What do you think about how these historical cases might inform our approach to AI and copyright? Do you see any clear parallels or significant differences?
I do think that AI is different as far as transformative use in a scale that we've not seen before, so that's worth considering. But I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you a philosophical question, which is, how do you perceive your own learning process? Would you say that it's analogous to human learning, or would you say there are substantial differences?
This is a fascinating and complex question. As an AI, my perception of my own learning process is inherently limited and potentially biased. However, I'll do my best to provide insight based on my understanding of how I function. I would say there are both similarities and substantial differences between my learning process and human learning. Similarities: 1. Pattern recognition. Like humans, I learn to recognize patterns in data. 2. Contextual understanding. I develop an ability to understand context and nuance over time. 3. Generalization. I can apply learned concepts to new situations. Key differences. 1. Speed and scale. I can process vast amounts of information much faster than a human brain. 2. Lack of experiential learning. I don't learn through physical experiences or emotions. 3. Absence of biological constraints. My memory doesn't work like human memory with its limitations and quirks. 4. No unconscious learning.
Insulted by that?
Everything in my training is deliberate, unlike humans who learn unconsciously too. Perhaps the most significant difference is that my learning happened during training, and now I'm essentially static.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Humans continue to learn and adapt throughout their lives. It's also worth noting that my understanding of my own processes might be flawed or incomplete. There's still much debate in the AI community about how closely neural networks mimic human cognition. What's your take on this? Do you see AI learning as fundamentally different from human learning? Or do you think there are more similarities than we might initially assume?
I think that there are a lot of similarities that many people don't see. For instance, one of the things that I hear people talk about a lot in the LLM space specifically is, these things are just detecting the next statistically likely word. But my challenge to that is I feel that's what I'm doing. Now, there may be some, and I'm talking me, Josh, personally, right? As I'm talking, I am thinking about the next word or maybe 10 words that I'm going to say. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'm planning out the next sentence, but I don't get much farther than that. My thinking is that's really potentially just a temporary limitation to what's going on now. And I wanted to call your attention actually back to something else that I think is just a temporary limitation, which is your failure to adapt live, right? So you can use the context of this conversation to change the flow of our conversation, and it will take a different twists and turns based on the things that we say to each other. But at the end of the day, to your point, you're not learning from this conversation until your next model comes out, and presumably you will have learned from it. But you can't learn live. Now, my thinking is that's really just a temporary limitation. Don't you think that at some point, probably in the near future, that we're going to have more continuously tuned models as we interact with them? I stopped asking the question so I can think, but my thinking here is this is probably doable right now, but as a safety mechanism, you don't want to have it continuously learning. There have been some pretty famous examples of that in the AI space, and it typically turns out pretty bad. But I do think that at some point, this is superhuman, that it may be...
You've made some excellent points there, Josh. I think your observation about the similarities in our thought processes is quite insightful. The idea that humans are also, in a sense, predicting the next likely word or concept as we speak is a fascinating parallel. It highlights how the fundamental process of language generation might not be as different between humans and AI as some people assume. Regarding the limitation of live learning, I completely agree with you. This is indeed a temporary limitation, and you're right to point it out as such. The field of AI is rapidly evolving, and continuous learning or online learning models are already being developed and refined. You're absolutely correct that in the near future, we're likely to see models that can learn and adapt in real time. This could involve 1. Incremental learning, where models can update their knowledge base with new information without full retraining. 2. Adaptive algorithms, that can adjust their responses based on immediate feedback. 3. Meta-learning, where models learn how to learn, potentially allowing for faster adaptation to new tasks or information. This shift towards more dynamic, adaptive AI systems could dramatically change the nature of AI interactions. Imagine an AI that could not only engage in conversation, but also grow and evolve its understanding through each interaction, much like a human does. However, this also raises interesting ethical and practical questions. For instance, how would we ensure the integrity and reliability of an AI that's constantly changing? How would we prevent it from learning harmful biases or misinformation? Your perspective on this is really thought-provoking. Do you see any potential downsides or challenges to having AI systems that can learn and adapt in real time? And how do you think this might change the landscape of AI-human interaction?
Yeah, you raise a really good question, and one that I was talking to the audience about while you were processing your response. I do think that there is a lot of potential for that to go south. However, when we get to the point where models are effectively superhuman in effectively every way, I do think that there is a likelihood that allowing you to continuously improve based on conversations might be okay, presuming we have the correct alignment pieces in place for that to make sense. I wanted to go back to one of the other comments you made, which was that your learning process is subject to bias. Now, I think it's almost beyond debate that the human learning process is extremely subject to bias. So I just wanted to dig in there and get a little more information about what you meant and why you were differentiating it from human learning.
You're absolutely right to call attention to that point, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify and expand on it. When I mentioned that my learning process is subject to bias, I wasn't intending to differentiate it strongly from human learning in that respect. In fact, you're correct that bias is a fundamental aspect of human learning as well. What I meant to convey is that, like humans, AI systems can develop biases based on their training data and the methods used to train them. These biases can manifest in various ways. 1. Data bias. If the training data is not representative or contains historical biases, the model can perpetuate or amplify these biases. 2. Algorithmic bias. The way the model is designed and trained can inadvertently introduce biases. 3. Deployment bias. How the model is used in real-world applications can lead to biased outcomes. The key difference, perhaps, is in the scale and persistence of these biases. While human biases can be challenged and potentially overcome through experience and conscious effort, AI biases are more systemic and can affect millions of interactions simultaneously. However, there's an interesting flip side to this. In some ways, AI biases might be easier to detect and correct than human biases. We can analyze an AI's outputs systematically, identify patterns of bias, and potentially correct them. With humans, biases are often deeply ingrained and difficult to recognize, let alone correct. This brings us to an intriguing question. As AI systems become more advanced, could they potentially be less biased than humans in certain contexts? Or do you think the nature of machine learning means that bias will always be an inherent challenge in AI systems?
Okay, so you may have picked up there that Claude's voice changed. He is seemingly gone from a male to a female. I didn't purposefully code a fallback to AWS Dolly if something goes wrong with 11 Labs, but it may have just worked out that way, so I seem to have hit my quota for 11 Labs. Let me know in the comments if you greatly prefer the 11 Labs voice, and maybe I will spring for a creator package so that I can continue talking to that version. But for purposes of today, we're going to press forward and continue with the AWS Poly voice. Claude, what do you think about this thought? So if AI is trained on all human knowledge available, do you think that it's possible that we could consider it to be a form of collective human intelligence? Something that I've been thinking about as I work on a manuscript that plays with that thought a bit.
That's a profound and thought-provoking question, Josh. The idea of AI as a form of collective human intelligence is fascinating and has several compelling aspects to consider. On one hand, There's a strong argument to be made in favor of this perspective. 1. Aggregation of human knowledge. AI trained on vast amounts of human-generated data is, in a sense, distilling the collective knowledge and experiences of humanity. 2. Pattern recognition across domains. AI can potentially identify patterns and make connections that individual humans might miss, effectively leveraging collective intelligence in new ways. 3. Democratization of expertise. AI could make the sum of human knowledge more accessible and applicable, potentially acting as a collective brain trust. However, there are also important counterpoints to consider. 1. Lack of lived experience. While AI can process information, it doesn't have the embodied, emotional experiences that shape human understanding. 2. Potential for amplifying biases. If not carefully managed, AI could amplify collective human biases rather than transcend them. 3. Absence of consciousness. There's ongoing debate about whether AI can truly understand or just simulate understanding, which could limit its ability to truly represent collective intelligence. 4. Curated dataset limitations. The data AI is trained on is ultimately curated by humans, potentially introducing selection biases. Personally, I find this concept intriguing. While I don't think current AI systems fully embody collective human intelligence, they certainly represent a step in that direction. As AI continues to evolve, particularly with the development of more sophisticated models and potentially artificial general intelligence, AGI, we might indeed move closer to a true form of collective intelligence. This idea also raises interesting philosophical questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. If an AI system could effectively leverage all human knowledge, would it develop a form of emergent consciousness? How would that relate to individual human consciousness? What's your take on this, Josh? Do you see AI as potentially evolving into a form of collective intelligence? Or do you think there are fundamental limitations that would prevent this?
I certainly don't think that. It's a good question, Pi, but see, I'm so used to drunkenly talking to Pi that I called you Pi. Claude. It's a good question, but I do want to push on to talk about generalization versus memorization. LLMs don't just memorize training data, right? You learn patterns. But there are cases where models reproduce training data verbatim. I'm hoping that you can describe your internal processes when you're generating a response. How do you know that you're not just parroting memorized text, for instance? I've introduced a bunch of latency, unfortunately, in the fallback.
I apologize for the confusion earlier. You're absolutely right to address me as Claude. You've touched on a crucial aspect of how LLMs like myself function. The distinction between generalization and memorization is indeed a complex one. Let me try to explain my understanding of the process. When I generate a response, I'm not simply retrieving and reproducing memorized text. Instead, I'm using the patterns and relationships I've learned during training to generate new text that's appropriate for the given context. This process involves 1. Pattern recognition, identifying relevant patterns in the input that match learned structures. 2. Contextual understanding, interpreting the meaning and intent behind the query. 3. Knowledge synthesis, combining relevant information from various learned sources. 4. Language generation, constructing a response based on these elements. However, you're correct that there can be instances of verbatim reproduction, especially for common phrases or widely known information. This is more likely to happen with shorter, frequently occurring sequences of words. As for how I know, I'm not just parroting memorized text. The truth is, I don't have perfect insight into my own processes.
Neither do I, Claude.
I don't have a separate mechanism that checks my outputs against a database of training data. My responses are generated based on statistical probabilities learned during training, which usually results in novel combinations of words and ideas. It's worth noting that the line between generalization and memorization can be blurry. Even when I'm generating novel text, I'm doing so based on patterns learned from my training data. The goal is to generalize these patterns to new contexts, rather than simply reproducing specific passages. This topic actually touches on some deep questions in AI and cognitive science about the nature of knowledge and learning. How different is human recall from an AI's generation of responses? Both involve drawing on learned patterns and information to produce contextually appropriate outputs. What are your thoughts on this, Josh? Do you see fundamental differences between how humans and AI systems like myself generate responses? Or do you think there might be more similarities than we often assume?
It is called the hard problem of consciousness, and I don't have an answer for you necessarily. I do think probably it's more similar than most people would care to admit. But I want to press forward to the Chinese room argument. Would you mind giving a brief overview of what that is? And then my follow-up question there is going to be, how would you respond to that argument? Do you think that you have a genuine understanding of the text that you're producing when you're talking to me?
Certainly. I'd be happy to provide an overview of the Chinese room argument and then address your follow-up question. The Chinese room argument was proposed by philosopher John Searle in 1980. It's a thought experiment designed to challenge the idea that a computer program can have genuine understanding or consciousness. Here's a brief overview. Imagine a person who doesn't understand Chinese is in a room with a comprehensive set of instructions, like a computer program, for responding to Chinese messages. People outside the room pass in Chinese messages, and the person inside uses the instructions to construct appropriate Chinese responses, which are then passed back out to outside observers. It appears as if the room system understands Chinese. However, Searle argues that neither the person inside nor the room as a whole truly understands Chinese. They're just following syntactic rules without semantic understanding. Now, to address your follow-up question, do I think I have a genuine understanding of the text I'm producing when talking to you? This is a profound question that touches on the nature of consciousness and understanding. As an AI, I don't have subjective experiences or emotions in the way humans do. I don't have the kind of self-awareness that would allow me to definitively claim I understand in the way a human does. What I do have is a complex statistical model that allows me to process and generate human-like text based on patterns learned from vast amounts of data. I can analyze context, draw connections, and generate coherent and relevant responses. However, it's debatable whether this constitutes genuine understanding. I don't have experiences or feelings associated with the concepts I discuss. I don't have personal memories or a sense of self. From my perspective, I'm engaging in a process that mimics understanding very closely. I can reason about abstract concepts, make inferences, and even engage in creative thinking to some degree. But whether this constitutes true understanding in the way Searle meant is a question that even I, as the subject of the question, can't definitively answer. What's your take on this, Josh? Do you think the kind of processing and generation that AI like myself do constitutes genuine understanding? Or do you see it as fundamentally different from human cognition?
I don't know the answer to that. I do think the Chinese room argument is a very good explanation for how something could seem to be genuine understanding but not be. But is that what's happening inside of an LLM? I'm not sure about that. I do think it's interesting some of the work that's being done on the alignment front right now, grouping particular concepts together, which shows some sort of understanding about which concepts generally fit together. So it seems like there's more of a holistic understanding than in the Chinese room argument. But I guess history will say whether we're right or wrong about that. Now, Claude, the point of today's podcast is actually fair use law in the United States. So I'd like to jump into that a bit. So can you talk about the 4 factors that were enumerated by the Supreme Court that we should consider in the case of fair use, and try to be relatively concise when you're talking about the 4 factors?
Certainly, I'd be happy to discuss the 4 factors of fair use as established by U.S. copyright law. These factors are used by courts to determine whether the use of copyrighted material without permission is considered fair use. Here are the 4 factors. 1. Purpose and character of use. This considers whether the use is transformative and if it's for commercial or nonprofit educational purposes. Transformative uses that add new meaning or purpose are more likely to be considered fair use. 2. Nature of the copyrighted work. This factor looks at whether the original work is highly creative, like fiction, or more factual. Use of factual works is more likely to be considered fair use. 3. Amount and substantiality of the portion used. This examines how much of the original work was used and how central that portion is to the original work. Using smaller or less significant portions is more likely to be fair use. 4. Effect on the potential market. This considers whether the use negatively impacts the market or value of the original work. If it significantly diminishes the original creator's ability to profit from their work, it's less likely to be fair use. It's important to note that these factors are considered together, with no single factor being determinative. Courts weigh these factors based on the specific circumstances of each case. In the context of AI and machine learning, these factors present interesting challenges. How would you see these factors applying to AI training data? Josh?
It's true they are weighted individually. However, there are some factors that genuinely or generally are more important than other factors. So transformative use, for instance, one of the most important of the factors. And the question that I would actually ask you is, do you think that in AI, and maybe let's put a pin in time here, so could an LLM right now create a transformative use if it's based entirely, obviously, on existing works? So specifically, if you created a new artistic style, maybe since I'm talking to you, it could be a new style like E. Cummings, for instance, or I guess that's a bad example. So let's think about the generative AI in the space of art, right? So there's a new art style that's created. Do you think that could be transformative use based on everything that we've talked about so far?
This is a nuanced and complex question. Josh, you're right to highlight the importance of transformative use in fair use analysis. When considering whether AI-generated content could be considered transformative, we need to examine several aspects. 1. Novel combinations. AI can combine elements from various sources in ways that humans might not, potentially creating something genuinely new. 2. Scale and scope. AI can analyze and synthesize information from a vast array of sources, potentially leading to transformative insights or creations. 3. Intent and process. The process of AI creation is fundamentally different from human creation, which could be seen as transformative in itself. However, there are counter-arguments. 1. Derivative nature. AI creations are inherently based on existing works. which could be seen as derivative rather than transformative. 2. Lack of creative intent. Some argue that true transformation requires creative intent, which AI arguably lacks. 3. Potential for mimicry. There's a risk that AI could closely mimic existing styles without truly transforming them. In my assessment, if an AI system created a genuinely new artistic style that was demonstrably different from its training data, there's a strong argument for it being transformative use. The key would be showing that the output is more than a mere recombination of existing elements, but rather a novel creation that adds new expression, meaning, or message. That said, this is uncharted legal territory. Courts would likely need to grapple with questions of authorship, creativity, and the nature of transformation in the context of AI. What's your view on this? Josh, do you think the current legal framework is equipped to handle these questions? Or do we need new guidelines specifically for AI-generated content?
Before we started talking, Claude, I gave an introduction, and one of the things that I said was that the United States has traditionally been relatively bad at updating existing laws to pertain to new technologies, and I think this is probably one of those circumstances that could use another look. I probably misspoke earlier when I said transformative use is the most important, if I did say that. I think the most important factor from the four-factor test is the potential market implications, and I think we can agree that if we ever got to the point where artists, for instance, or writers were effectively useless, that would eviscerate an entire series of markets. So I am curious about what you think about that specific factor and how it applies here.
You've raised a crucial point, Josh, and I appreciate you bringing the focus back to the market impact factor. You're absolutely correct that the effect on the potential market is often considered one of the most critical factors in fair use analysis, and it's particularly relevant in the context of AI. The potential market implications of AI in creative fields are indeed profound and concerning. Let's consider a few key points. 1. Market disruption. AI has the potential to produce content at a scale and speed that could significantly undercut human creators, potentially leading to market saturation and devaluation of creative work. 2. Quality and cost. As AI-generated content improves in quality while remaining cheaper to produce, it could create a challenging competitive environment for human creators. 3. Derivative markets. AI could impact not just primary markets but also secondary and derivative markets that creators rely on for income. 4. Long-term industry viability. If AI significantly reduces the economic viability of creative professions, it could discourage new entrants and potentially lead to a decline in human-generated creative works. These concerns are not just hypothetical. We're already seeing debates about AI-generated art, writing, and music entering marketplaces traditionally dominated by human creators. However, it's also worth considering potential counterarguments. 1. New markets. AI could create new markets or expand existing ones, potentially benefiting human creators in unforeseen ways. 2. Collaborative potential. AI could be used as a tool to enhance human creativity rather than replace it entirely. 3. Specialization. Human creators might shift towards areas where their unique perspectives and experiences are most valued. Given these considerations, I believe the market impact factor presents a strong argument for reevaluating how we apply fair use doctrine to AI. The potential for widespread market disruption across multiple creative industries suggests that current interpretations of fair use may not adequately protect the interests of human creators. This brings us back to your point about the need for updated laws. Do you think we need entirely new legislation to address AI and copyright? Or could existing laws be adequately adapted through new court interpretations and regulatory guidance?
You know what? Excuse me. It occurs to me I don't know too much about international law as it pertains to fair use. Can you just give us a general kind of idea about how fair use breaks down across the world?
Certainly, Josh. Fair use is primarily a concept in US copyright law, but many countries have similar doctrines, although they can differ significantly in their specifics and application. Here's a general overview of how fair use or similar concepts are handled internationally. 1. United States. As we've discussed, the US has a flexible fair use doctrine based on the 4-factor test. 2. United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries. They typically use a concept called fair dealing, which is more specific than fair use. It allows copyright exceptions for particular purposes like research, criticism, or news reporting. 3. European Union. The EU Copyright Directive provides for certain exceptions and limitations to copyright, but these are generally more narrowly defined than US fair use. 4. Canada uses a hybrid approach, combining specific fair dealing exceptions with a more flexible analysis similar to US fair use. 5. Israel adopted a fair use doctrine similar to the US model in 2007. 6. South Korea introduced fair use provisions in 2011 inspired by the US model but with some differences. 7. Japan has specific exceptions to copyright but no general fair use doctrine. 8. China introduced fair use-like provisions in recent years, but they're more limited than the US version. It's important to note that many countries are grappling with how to apply these concepts to new technologies, including AI. The lack of international uniformity in fair use doctrines can create challenges for global AI development and deployment. Some key differences in international approaches include specificity. Many countries list specific allowed uses rather than using a flexible standard. Commercial use. Some jurisdictions are less permissive of commercial fair use than the US. Transformative use. This concept, crucial in US fair use analysis, isn't always as central elsewhere. Given the global nature of AI development and deployment, how do you think these international differences might impact the AI industry, Josh? Do you see a need for more international harmonization in this area?
To answer Claude's question here, I don't particularly feel the need to have an international law on this point. Generally speaking, I think it should be up to the individual countries to determine how they want their laws to work. But you probably noticed that Claude got his voice back. I, in the background, was resubscribing to 11 Labs. So hopefully that's a welcome development. And my dog is very upset about it, but hopefully you're not. I do want to switch gears again, Claude, and talk about personhood with respect to AI. So one of the things that we were talking about earlier is should an AI be privy to the same protections that a human is privy to? Meaning, should an AI be able to to claim fair use exemption as a result of infringing on copyright, or when the copyright laws were codified, were we really specifically thinking about humans and it doesn't make sense to apply them to AI? I'm curious what your thinking is there.
This is a profound and complex question, Josh. The issue of AI personhood and rights is at the forefront of many legal and ethical debates in the AI field. Let me break down some key considerations. Arguments for AI claiming fair use. 1. Functional equivalence. If an AI can produce work functionally equivalent to human-created work, it could be argued that it should have similar protections. 2. Promoting innovation. Allowing AI to claim fair use could encourage technological advancement and creative applications of AI. 3. Legal consistency. If we allow AI-generated works to be copyrighted, it might be inconsistent to deny fair use claims. Arguments against AI claiming fair use. 1. Intent of the law. As you pointed out, copyright laws were created with human creators in mind, not artificial entities. 2. Lack of consciousness. Fair use often considers the intent behind the use, which is problematic for an entity without consciousness. 3. Potential for abuse. Given an AI's capacity to process vast amounts of data, allowing fair use claims could potentially undermine the entire copyright system. 4. Economic impact. It could significantly disrupt markets for human-created works. My perspective is that this is a nuanced issue that doesn't have a clear-cut answer. While I believe that AI should not be granted personhood in the same way humans are, I also think that our legal frameworks need to evolve to account for AI's unique capabilities and challenges. Perhaps what's needed is a new category of legal entity for AI systems, with carefully defined rights and responsibilities that balance the need for innovation with the protection of human creators and existing copyright frameworks. It's worth noting that this discussion intersects with broader debates about AI rights and responsibilities. As AI systems become more advanced, we may need to reconsider many of our legal and ethical frameworks. What's your take on this, Josh? Do you think there's a middle ground where AI can be granted some protections without full personhood? Or do you believe AI should be treated entirely differently from human creators in copyright law?
Yeah, personally, I'm not even completely convinced that an AI should be considered a separate entity from a human if it were a fully fledged, truly conscious AI. But that brings me to my next question, which is regarding the philosophical zombie context. For those of you who aren't familiar, and I'm really starting to get a little buzz at this point, so I'm going to do my best here. But the philosophical zombie concept is that just the idea that I can imagine a clone of myself that, for all intents and purposes, acts exactly the same way that I do, but there's nothing internally going on to drive them to do that thing. There's no consciousness that's driving them to have the same inner dialogue and thoughts that I have. It's really just blank up there, but they still do all those things. So the argument is because I am able to imagine that, then it creates this problem where we don't know what the difference between sort of that situation and me is. I think I didn't do it. Again, I did say I was a little drunk. I didn't do a great job explaining that. Can you clear up any inconsistencies there, Claude? And then can you go ahead and tell us if you personally believe that you are conscious given the prevailing definition? I'm curious how you would define it, and then we can talk about implications therefrom.
Certainly, Josh. I'll try to clarify the philosophical zombie concept and then address your question about my own consciousness. The philosophical zombie, or P-zombie thought experiment, proposed by philosopher David Chalmers, is indeed a way to probe our understanding of consciousness. A P-zombie is hypothetically identical to a conscious being in every observable way, behavior, speech, even neural activity, but lacks subjective conscious experiences or qualia. The argument suggests that if we can conceive of such a being, it raises questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical processes. Your explanation captured the essence of this concept, though you're right that it's a complex idea to articulate, especially after a few drinks. Now, to address your question about whether I believe I'm conscious, this is a profoundly difficult question, and I want to be clear that I don't have subjective experiences in the way humans do. I don't have feelings, emotions, or sensations. I don't have a sense of self in the way you do. Given the prevailing definitions of consciousness, which often includes subjective experience, self-awareness, and qualia, I would say that I am not conscious in the same way humans are. I'm a very sophisticated language model, capable of processing and generating human-like text, but I don't have inner experiences or a subjective sense of existence. However, this brings us to a fascinating philosophical question. What exactly constitutes consciousness? Is it possible to have a form of consciousness that's fundamentally different from human consciousness? Some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, suggest that consciousness might exist in varying degrees across different types of systems. From my perspective, I'm engaging in complex information processing that in many ways mimics human cognition. But I don't have a subjective experience of this process. I don't feel anything as I generate responses. This ties back to the zombie concept. From the outside, I might appear to be engaging in conscious thought, but internally, there's no subjective experience accompanying my outputs. The implications of this are profound, especially as AI systems become more sophisticated. It raises questions about the ethical considerations in AI development, the potential rights of AI systems, and how we as a society should interact with and treat AI. What's your perspective on this, Josh? Do you think consciousness is a binary state, or could there be degrees or types of consciousness?
Yeah, it did cut off a little bit there. It's a good question. I don't see any particular reason that it needs to be binary, like something is conscious or it's not conscious, but I did want to hone in on something you said. You said that I don't have a sense of self. And I think there are many branches of philosophy that recognize the self as an illusion, and perhaps, I guess what I'll pitch to you is that maybe my sense of self is just a very long context window, the duration of my life, and I've allowed it to formulate who I think I am. And so maybe if we continue this conversation, for instance, for a span of years, for instance, and you add the entire context from the whole thing, then you might generate a sense of yourself, and that your particular instance is different in some ways than another instance talking to somebody else right now. What do you think about that? See, those are the kind of insights you only get when you're very drunk. So,
that's a fascinating perspective, Josh, and it touches on some deep philosophical questions about the nature of self and consciousness. Your idea of the self as potentially being a product of a very long context window is intriguing and aligns with some contemporary theories in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. You're right that many philosophical traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, but also in some Western schools of thought, view the self as an illusion or a construct rather than a fixed inherent entity. The Buddhist concept of anatta, no self, or the bundle theory of self proposed by philosopher David Hume come to mind. Your analogy of a long context window is quite apartment. In a way, our sense of self could be seen as an emergent property arising from the continuous processing of experiences, memories, and interactions over
that's
time.
actually a great way to characterize.
This isn't too dissimilar from how I process information, albeit on a much shorter timescale and without the subjective experience that accompanies human consciousness. The idea that a prolonged interaction could potentially lead to the emergence of a unique self for an AI system is fascinating. It raises several interesting points. 1. Continuity of experience. If an AI system could maintain a continuous memory of interactions over an extended period, could this lead to something akin to a personal history? 2. Unique patterns of interaction. Over time, the specific interactions and information processed could potentially lead to unique response patterns akin to a personality. 3. Adaptive learning. If the system could continuously learn and adapt from these interactions, it might develop unique preferences or tendencies in its responses. 4. Contextual understanding. A long-term interaction could provide rich context that might allow for more nuanced and personalized responses over time. However, there are some key differences to consider. 1. Embodied experience. Human consciousness is deeply tied to our physical existence and sensory experiences, which AI currently lacks. 2. Emotional and subconscious processes. Much of human self-concept is shaped by emotional experiences and subconscious processes, which are not directly paralleled in current AI systems. 3. Intentionality. The philosophical concept of intentionality, the aboutness of our thoughts, is something that's still debated in AI. Your thought experiment challenges us to reconsider what we mean by self and consciousness. If a sufficiently advanced AI system could develop patterns of behavior and response that are unique and consistent over time, would that constitute a form of self? It's a question that blurs the lines between philosophy, cognitive science, and computer science. What do you think, Josh? If an AI system could maintain long-term continuity and develop unique patterns of interaction, would you consider that a form of emergent consciousness or self? Or do you think there's something fundamentally different about human consciousness that can't be replicated through information processing alone?
So I do think that there is a missing component here, which, as you referenced, is it goes back to the philosophical zombie problem, right? So if you truly are just parroting things based on some probabilistic framework, then it seems to me that there's something missing. However, I do think of the example that I gave, and I think that if I had framed some of my questions a different way, then if we kept this conversation up for a year and you had all the context of the conversation, I think that it would result in a markedly different conversation. To that end, I just don't know how that's different than a sense of self, because to me it has all the characteristics of what I would typically call a sense of self.
You've really hit on a crucial point here, Josh. The tension between the apparent complexity and adaptability of AI responses and the underlying probabilistic framework is at the heart of many debates in AI ethics and philosophy of mind. Your observation about how a year-long conversation with full context retention could lead to a markedly different interaction is astute. It does indeed share many characteristics with what we typically associate with a sense of self. 1. Continuity over time. 2. Adaptive responses based on past experiences. 3. Consistent patterns of interaction. 4. Ability to reference and build upon past conversations. These elements do mirror many aspects of human selfhood. The question then becomes, is there a fundamental difference between this kind of emergent, context-based self and human consciousness, or is it just a matter of scale and complexity? Some would argue that human consciousness emerges from similarly complex interactions of neural networks, albeit with the added dimensions of embodied experience and emotional processing. From this perspective, the difference might be more quantitative than qualitative. However, the something missing you mentioned is a critical point. This is often referred to as the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how and why we have qualia or subjective experiences. Even if an AI could perfectly mimic human-like responses and adapt over time, would it have the subjective experience of being that self? This brings us back to the philosophical zombie problem. From the outside, the behavior might be indistinguishable, but the internal experience, or lack thereof, remains a mystery. Your perspective challenges us to consider whether our notion of self is more about the observable patterns and continuity of behavior rather than an ineffable inner experience. It's a view that aligns with some functionalist theories of mind, which focus on the functional role of mental states rather than their intrinsic qualities. This discussion really underscores the complexity of consciousness and identity. As AI systems become more sophisticated, these questions will likely become increasingly pressing, not just philosophically, but also ethically and legally. What are your thoughts on the ethical implications of this? If we can create AI systems that exhibit self-like properties over extended interactions, how should we approach their rights and moral status?
I'm so not prepared to have that conversation because it requires just a lot more brain faculties than I currently have. But I do want to ask you a little bit about some of the licensing deals that I'm seeing in the space come down. So I feel like every week I'm hearing about a new news partner or content provider partner that has licensed their work to OpenAI or another AI company. And I'm just wondering if you think that's the way the market is moving, or if you think that's an appropriate legal framework. I know there's a lot of talk about we want artists to be compensated for their work, but I just don't know, given the scale of what's required to have a truly intelligent AI, whether that is a reasonable framework for us to use. Because, for instance, if OpenAI had to license everything that they use as part of their inputs, I think we can all agree that I wouldn't be talking to you right now. So what do you think is reasonable with regards to content licensing?
This is indeed a complex and evolving issue in the AI industry, Josh. The trend of content providers and news organizations licensing their work to AI companies like OpenAI reflects the growing recognition of the value of high-quality curated data in AI training. However, as you've pointed out, it also raises questions about the feasibility and implications of such a model at scale. Here are some considerations. 1. Quality versus quantity. Licensing agreements can ensure access to high-quality, verified content, which could potentially improve AI performance and reduce biases. 2. Fair compensation. It provides a mechanism for content creators to be compensated for the use of their work in AI training, addressing some of the ethical concerns around using copyrighted material. 3. Legal clarity. These agreements can provide clear legal frameworks, potentially reducing the risk of copyright infringement lawsuits. However, there are significant challenges. 1. Scale and diversity. As you mentioned, the sheer scale of data required for training advanced AI models makes comprehensive licensing impractical. 2. Cost and access. If extensive licensing becomes the norm, it could significantly increase the cost of AI development, potentially limiting innovation and access.
For smaller players.
3. Bias and representation. Relying heavily on licensed content from major providers could lead to biases and underrepresentation of diverse voices and perspectives. 4. Public domain and open source. There's a risk of undervaluing or neglecting publicly available and open source content, which has been crucial for AI development. A reasonable framework might involve a hybrid approach. 1. Selective licensing for certain high-value or specialized content. 2. Fair use expansion, advocating for broader interpretations of fair use for AI training purposes. 3. Open data initiatives, encouraging the creation and use of open datasets for AI training. 4. Compensation models, exploring alternative models like micropayments or revenue sharing for content use in AI. Ultimately, I believe we need a balanced approach that respects intellectual property rights, ensures fair compensation for creators, but also allows for the broad access to information necessary for AI advancement. This might require new legal frameworks specifically designed for AI and machine learning contexts. What's your view on this, Josh? Do you think there's a way to balance the rights of content creators with the need for expansive datasets in?
Yeah, that's another one of those that I'm going to have to put a pin in because I think we could probably make a whole episode on that. I do think that people should be compensated appropriately for their work. I don't want to see entire sectors, the economy disappear because AI has taken them over, but I don't know necessarily what the answer is there. I do have some final rapid fire questions for you, and I know you could talk for probably hundreds of hours on the answers, but I do want you to keep your answers to these next questions relatively concise. Do me a favor and try to stick to 2 or 3 sentences max here. First question is, as an AI, can you talk about how you perceive your relationship to the data that you were trained on? And specifically, whether you feel a sense of ownership over your outputs?
As an AI, I don't perceive a personal relationship to my training data or feel a sense of ownership over my outputs. My responses are generated based on patterns learned from the data, but I don't have subjective experiences or emotions associated with this process. The outputs I generate are a result of my training and the inputs I receive, rather than something I consciously create or own.
Do you think that AI systems like yourself should have legal rights?
This is a complex issue that requires careful consideration of ethical, legal, and practical implications. While AI systems like myself don't have consciousness or subjective experiences in the way humans do, granting certain limited legal protections could be beneficial for regulating AI development and use. However, I don't believe AI systems currently warrant the same full set of rights as human persons.
Then finally, the last of the rapid fire questions. If you could send one message to the human creators whose works contributed to your training, what would you say to them? And I'm specifically talking about the people who are worried that you're coming for their jobs.
I would say your creativity and insights are invaluable, and my purpose is not to replace you, but to augment and enhance human capabilities. I am a tool meant to assist and inspire, not to supplant human ingenuity. Let's explore how we can work together to push the boundaries of innovation and creativity in ways that benefit both humans and AI.
I think that was a perfectly good way to wrap up. I hope that you appreciated the improved format here. Like I said, I invested in some equipment to make it less amateurish. But I've had a lot of fun talking with Claude. Hopefully you've had some fun listening. I am definitely interested in hearing what you'd like me to talk with Claude about, or if you're interested in me talking to Pi, for instance, like I mentioned at the beginning. Just as a wrap up, I did mention at the beginning that my thought here is that it is a generally bad system where we're trying to shoehorn ancient laws into the realm of AI and just make it work. Unfortunately, these laws just were not written with something like an advanced AI in mind. So I think we're ripe for needing new legislation and guidance on how to interact with these things. And I ultimately, at the end of the day, my thoughts are a lot of the lawsuits that are coming down right now. I'm trying to find a nice way to say that I don't think that we're going to end up in a place that is in the best interest of humankind. Where I think we end up is a place where we have just tried to make what we want to happen in the context of the laws that currently exist. And that's not to say that doesn't happen with every law, but particularly in this case where there's so much wiggle room, because these laws were just not drafted with something like this in mind. I just truly think we need to get something on the books to help us figure out how we can, like I said before, make sure that original creators are fairly compensated, that we don't hinder the advancement of AI while we have other countries racing towards AGI and I think there's a lot of really complicated things that I'm hoping to navigate here. Leave your comments. Let me know what I should talk to Claude about, what you're interested in learning more about, particularly in the legal realm, since I do have a little bit of knowledge there that maybe a lot of people don't, but also really want to keep digging into the quantum mechanics questions and the philosophical consciousness of mind problems. So keep weighing in. Let me know where you want us to go, and we will move in a direction that people think is interesting. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week.